Hello viewers, welcome to CodeForAny. Fruit Market Node.js apps inside. Today need to make this here. The API we need to fix this here. The related to designs we need to making here. Before we need to make this here the single order to direct to show this here the address, latitude, longitude, chips like this. Total amounts we need to show the admin sites need to shop owners we need to showing like this data. But we need to change this here the related to making here the new UI. That's why I need to change this API. First of all, we need to make here the create here the alias for these tables, and we need to inner joins need to write down here. Now need to write down here the OD, like so need to give this here the alias, and every place we need to replace with this alias, and we need to making here change this API is better. Now we need to put this here the everything's like here latitudes, longitudes, zip codes for related to address, totals, order amounts, offer amounts, delivery amounts, and then after the user payable amounts. And we need to show this here the status column here no needs because we need to use this here the item individually. You need to put here. That's why I need to change here. Now need to all that status inside. Need to managing this here the payment tabs, and also need to set here the payment tabs like here. Setting here the configurations are the needs here, and we need to set this here. Now this is the where conditions. After we need to putting this here the inner joins, we need to configure here. Now need to write down here the inner joins, and to join this here the order item tables we need to needs for here the join. Now need to go here. First of all, need to open this here the database, and we need to connect with this here item related information we need to show here, and to configure this here. First of all, need to set this here the order item details tables we need to manage here, and to find out here the this items order ID we need to needs, because we need to next API we need to develop this here the order accepted and rejected, so need to manage this here. Maybe sometimes we need to out of stocks need to possibles here the, that's why I need to make here the one API for the accept, and accept means here the user order process sets. Next we need to configure here. Now we need to managing this here these tables we need to configure here. First of all we need to set this here the order item tables. We need to managing this here the order items dot details, and we need to set this here the as OID, and we need to set here the on methods. We need to write down here the OID dot, we need to call this here the order underscore ID equal to, we need to call this here the OD dot order underscore ID, like this. Managing this here for the inner joins we need to making here. Then after we need to bind here the main ID. We need to OID dots, we need to call this here the item order ID. Item need to call this here the column names, need to copy and to paste this here for related to this data, and we need to replace years. Now this is like we need to putting this years. Then after we need to set here the item ID, also need to configure here the OID dot items underscore ID. Then after we need to need this here the OID dot price ID, which price this data need to connect it like this. We need to configure this here, and also need to managing here the cart ID not matters here. We need to configure this here. Then after we need to item price, we need to also need to put here OID dot, need to set here the total amount like here. Then after we need to configure this here the offer amounts like this. We need to configure this here the offer amounts, need to OID dot offer underscore ID, maybe amounts is good. Like here's order amounts. Then after we need to OID dot pay underscore amount, like we need to configure this here, and need to maybe any reasons to reject for these years. We need to set here the reasons for the rejection reasons to also show here, and managing this here the status. because need to new orders, accepted orders, like this order status need to managing this here the OID. To individually items need to managing this years, need to order accepted, waiting for delivery, package done, like this output delivery, like this managing for this status. You need to use this here the order status, as you need to give this here alias order underscore status, like need to managing this years, and we need to configure this years. Now this is the inner joins are the done, and now we need to find out here the which items names, also item image, item descriptions, like informations need to get, need to another inner tables, need to managing this years. Now need to call here the inner joins, inner join, and we need to write down here inner joins as items underscore details as id into iid, like this. We need to give this here, so id maybe need to conflict with here the individually use this here the id columns. That's why I need to change this here the iid. You need to put this alias names, and when this here the iid iid dot need to call this here the items underscore id equal to need to call this here the oid dot item id. Like this, we need to managing this here for this data, and we need to bind with here the additional data. So need to put here, after here we need to set here the iid dots, need to give this here the items underscore name columns. Then after so need to managing here the iid dots, need this here the image, and we need to call this here the image, need to bind with here the image data. We need to put this here the all items inside into case conditions. So need to put like this here for the image. Now need to copy any case conditions, because we need to change this here the data. Need to like this, need to cut these columns, and we need to replace with this here the image columns, and we need to paste here, and also need to set like this data, need to setting here. And then after so need to setting here the descriptions, item descriptions, need to write down here the iid dot, need to call this here the descriptions, like here's description columns, need to put here, set here the structures, and we need to select this here the item details, and we need to configure this here the descriptions, and image need to, like we need to configure ours, need to setting here so all things. And then after so need to managing here the other things, so need to putting here, and make sure so need to remove this here the address id and latitude longitude. So need to also managing this here to use this here, and we need to check here the related to price tables, also need to manage here the related to quantities, and so need to manage this here the quantity also need to show here. That's why I need to connect here the carts id inner joins. So need to write down here the inner joins, and need to write down here the cart detail tables. So need to use here so detail, and as we need to give this here the cd on methods, we need to configure this here, and then after we need to write down here the iid, not I need to oid dots order detail table, order item details, need to give this here the carts underscore id. Like you need to configurations are the needs here for these tables, are the managing these here, and we need to putting this here this everything here. And then after so we need to connect this here the tables with to cd dot cart underscore id, like here's, and we need to managing this here the after the descriptions, need to use this here the quantity cd dots, need to call this here the qty, like so need to put here. Now need to check inside the database columns, other columns need to needs here, and to check this here cart details and quantity, like we need to putting here. And then afterwards we need to another inner joins, we need to put here related to price tables. So need to configure here. Now need to open this here the price detail tables, look like this here the show, and to find out here the unit id, as well as need to show here the amounts of the specific these items amounts, we need to put here. Now another inner joins, we need to put here inner join, like here's, and we need to set this here the price detail, price underscore details, as we need to set here pd, and on methods need to write down here pd dot, need to call this here the price underscore id equal to, need to call this here the methods inside the, need to managing this here the order item details inside OID dot price ID. Need to managing this years for like this query and to add signs like here's need to setting here the some informations and another inner joins need to put here inner join and need to manage this here the unit detail alias we need to put here UD on methods need to call here and we need to configure this here the related informations need to put here. Now we need to set this here the other informations we need to putting here. Now we need to write down here the UD is equal to we need to call here on here UD dot unit underscore ID equal to need to call this here the PD PD dot unit underscore ID. Like this, we need to put here's and we need to join this here's or we need to connect it here's and also another inner joins for the related to user information's names. Need to put here's user detail tables as we need to give this here the UUDID UUD and on methods we need to call this here the OD dot user underscore ID equal to need to call this here the UUD and we need to set this here the user underscore ID like here so need to configure this here for these tables are managing this here need to configure here now need to add here some columns we need to needs here need to write down here UD is equal to unit name then after UUD dot so need to call this here the name property need to needs here specific this here the showing here the informations related to these orders we need to managing this here need to show here the names mobile numbers mobile codes we need to give in this here name and UD dot mobile add UD dot mobile underscore code like this we need to put here's and we need to managing here the PD dot price also need to forget here PD dot set here the amounts columns need to check cross verify and set these tables need to put here's need to amounts columns amounts like here's item here's item amount like here's need to set here's like this here's need to configure here's now we need to save and this query are the done here the new order list. If you like this video please give the thumbs up. If you're new user so please subscribe my channels and press the notification bell icon. You can get every new video notifications and awesome content. If you have any question so please write down the comment sections. I will help you and sort out your issue. Everyone have a nice day. Goodbye and take care.